spirit, and, seemingly, with augmented numbers. The soldiers were then led back into winter quarters, rejoicing in their hearts at having been compensated for their disasters at sea by a successful expedition. They were helped, too, by Caesar's bounty, which made good whatever loss any one declared he had suffered. It was also regarded as a certainty that the enemy were wavering and consulting on negotiations for peace, and that, with an additional campaign next summer, the war might be ended. Tiberius, however, in repeated letters advised Germanicus to return for the triumph decreed him. He had now had enough of success, enough of disaster. He had fought victorious battles on a great scale. He should also remember those losses which the winds and waves had inflicted, and which, though due to no fault of the general, were still grievous and shocking. He, Tiberius, had himself been sent 9 times by Augustus into Germany, and had done more by policy than by arms. By this means the submission of the Sugambri had been secured, and the Suevi, with their king Maroboduus, had been forced into peace. The Cherusci, too, and the other insurgent tribes, since the vengeance of Rome had been satisfied, might be left to their internal feuds. When Germanicus requested a year for the completion of his enterprise, Tiberius put a severer pressure on his modesty by offering him a second consulship, the functions of which he was to discharge in person. He also added that if war must still be waged, he might as well leave some materials for renown to his brother Drusus, who, as there was then no other enemy, could win only in Germany the imperial title and the triumphal laurel. Germanicus hesitated no longer, though he saw that this was a pretence, and that he was hurried away through jealousy from the glory he had already acquired. About the same time Libo Drusus, of the family of Scribonii, was accused of revolutionary schemes. I will explain somewhat minutely the beginning, progress, and end of this affair, since then first were originated those practices which for so many years have eaten into the heart of the state. Firmius Catus, a senator, an intimate friend of Libo's, prompted the young man, who was thoughtless and an easy prey to delusions, to resort to astrologers' promises, magical rites, and interpreters of dreams, dwelling ostentatiously on his great-grandfather Pompeius, his aunt Scribonia, who had formerly been wife of Augustus, his imperial cousins, his house crowded with ancestral busts, and urging him to extravagance and debt, himself the companion of his profligacy and desperate embarrassments, thereby to entangle him in all the more proofs of guilt. As soon as he found enough witnesses, with some slaves who knew the facts, he begged an audience of the emperor, after first indicating the crime and the criminal through Flaccus Vescularius, a Roman knight, who was more intimate with Tiberius than himself. Caesar, without disregarding the information, declined an interview, for the communication, he said, might be conveyed to him through the same messenger Flaccus. Meanwhile he conferred the praetorship on Libo, and often invited him to his table, showing no unfriendliness in his looks or anger in his words, so thoroughly had he concealed his resentment, and he wished to know all his sayings and doings, though it was in his power to stop them, till one Junius, who had been tampered with by Libo for the purpose of evoking by incantations spirits of the dead, gave information to Fulcinius Trio. Trio's ability was conspicuous among informers, as well as his eagerness for an evil notoriety. He at once pounced on the accused, went to the consuls, and demanded an inquiry before the Senate. The senators were summoned, with a special notice that they must consult on a momentous and terrible matter. Libo, meanwhile, in mourning apparel and accompanied by ladies of the highest rank, went to house after house, entreating his relatives and imploring some eloquent voice to ward off his perils, which all refused on different pretexts, but from the same apprehension. On the day the Senate met, jaded with fear and mental anguish, or, as some have related, feigning illness, he was carried in a litter to the doors of the Senate house, and, leaning on his brother, he raised his hands and voice in supplication to Tiberius, who received him with unmoved countenance. The emperor then read out the charges and the accusers' names, with such calmness as not to seem to soften or aggravate the accusations. Besides Trio and Catus, Fonteius Agrippa and Caius Vibius were among his accusers, and claimed with eager rivalry the privilege of conducting the case for the prosecution, till Vibius, as they would not yield one to the other, and Libo had entered without counsel, offered to state the charges against him singly, and produced an extravagantly absurd accusation, according to which Libo had consulted persons whether he would have such wealth as to be able to cover the Appian road as far as Brundisium with money. There were other questions of the same sort, quite senseless and idle, if leniently regarded, pitiable. But there was one paper in Libo's handwriting, so the prosecutor alleged, with the names of Caesars and of senators, to which marks were affixed of dreadful or mysterious significance. When the accused denied this, it was decided that his slaves, who recognized the writing, should be examined by torture. As an ancient statute of the Senate forbade such inquiry in a case affecting a master's life, Tiberius, with his cleverness in devising new law, ordered Libo's slaves to be sold singly to the state agent, so that, forsooth, without an infringement of the Senate's decree, Libo might be tried on their evidence. As a consequence, the defendant asked an adjournment till next day, and having gone home, he charged his kinsman, Publius Quirinus, with his last prayer to the emperor. The answer was that he should address himself to the Senate. Meanwhile his house was surrounded with soldiers. They crowded noisily even about the entrance, so that they could be heard and seen, when Libo, whose anguish drove him from the very banquet he had prepared as his last gratification, called for a minister of death, grasped the hands of his slaves, and thrust a sword into them. In their confusion, as they shrank back, they overturned the lamp on the table at his side, and in the darkness, now to him the gloom of death, he aimed 2 blows at a vital part. At the groans of the falling man, his freedmen hurried up, and the soldiers, seeing the bloody deed, stood aloof. Yet the prosecution was continued in the Senate with the same persistency, and Tiberius declared on oath that he would have interceded for his life, guilty though he was, but for his hasty suicide. His property was divided among his accusers, and praetorships out of the usual order were conferred on those who were of senator's rank. Cotta Messallinus then proposed that Libo's bust should not be carried in the funeral procession of any of his descendants, and Cneius Lentulus that no Scribonius should assume the surname of Drusus. Days of public thanksgiving were appointed on the suggestion of Pomponius Flaccus. Offerings were given to Jupiter, Mars, and Concord, and the 13th day of September, on which Libo had killed himself, was to be observed as a festival on the motion of Gallus Asinius, Papius Mutilus, and Lucius Apronius. I have mentioned the proposals and sycophancy of these men in order to bring to light this old standing evil in the state. decrees of the Senate were also passed to expel from Italy astrologers and magicians.